There is a clock ticking right now, and it is not the one Moscow wants the world to watch. While cameras stay fixed on the front line in Donetsk, on Kremlin parades, on the endless choreography of nuclear threats, something else has already happened. Something the Russian General Staff has spent 3 years insisting could not happen. A country roughly 1/3 the size of its enemy, with a smaller army, a smaller economy, a smaller air force, and no strategic bomber fleet of its own, has quietly imposed rules that Moscow now has to obey. Not politically, militarily. Ukraine has not just survived a firepower gap. Ukraine has redrawn the map of what firepower means in the 21st century. Russia today has more missiles, more artillery, more manpower, more shells, and more strike drones than at any point since February 2022. That is not propaganda. That is the uncomfortable fact. And yet, in the same week that Russian factories are producing missiles at record pace, Russian oil refineries are burning from Volgograd to the Baltic, Russian bomber wings are grounded, Russian ports are dormant, and Russian gasoline is rationed at the pump. This is the paradox that no headline captures cleanly. Russia has never had more firepower, and Russia has never had less control over what that firepower can actually do. This is not a story about one strike. It is a case study in why the assumption of a contained, symmetrical, attritional war was always going to fail. The rules changed. Kyiv wrote the new ones, and the West is only now beginning to read them. Start with what actually happened because the details matter. Between August 2025 and the first half of 2026, Ukraine executed the most sustained deep strike campaign against a nuclear-armed state in the history of modern warfare. According to the Carnegie Endowment's June 2026 analysis, Russia's average daily refined oil output dropped by up to 480,000 barrels, a 9% collapse compared with July 2025. The Moscow Times, citing Russian insurance data, put direct losses to the Russian oil sector at over 1 trillion rubles, approximately $13 billion for 2025 alone. That is not a nuisance campaign. That is a strategic degradation of the single sector that funds the Russian war machine. The tools that inflicted this damage were not Tomahawks. They were not F-35s. They were not delivered by NATO. The overwhelming majority were manufactured inside Ukraine at costs ranging from a few $1,000s per unit to, at the high end, roughly $500,000 for the new long-range cruise systems. Now take the second data point. On the night of June 1st, 2025, in an operation the Ukrainian security service codenamed Spiderweb, cargo trucks with hidden compartments unloaded swarms of small first-person view drones deep inside Russian territory, thousands of kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The targets were Russian strategic bomber bases at Olenya, Belaya, Diaghilevo, and Ivanovo. According to the Financial Times cited by the Carnegie Endowment, the strike destroyed or damaged roughly 20% of Russia's operationally ready long-range aviation. The Ukrainian side put the figure at 41 aircraft hit, with estimated damage of $7 billion. Independent open-source imagery has since confirmed multiple confirmed kills of Tu-95MS and Tu-22M3 bombers, the very platforms that carry the Kh-101 and Kh-22 cruise missiles Russia uses to terrorize Ukrainian cities. Think about that for a second. A country without a single strategic bomber of its own just amputated a fifth of the strategic bomber force of a nuclear superpower using drones smuggled in on the back of trucks, launched from crates that opened remotely. And the platforms hit are, by Russia's own doctrine, part of the leg of the nuclear triad. That was not a casual statement of capability. That was a doctrinal message written in burning aluminum. Here is where it gets more dangerous. Because Spiderweb was not the end of the campaign. It was the opening argument. For years, the Western strategic consensus on the Russia-Ukraine war rested on 3 assumptions, and it is worth stating them plainly, because the current moment is the moment they all break. The first assumption was symmetry of attrition, the idea that this would be a First World War-style grinder in which whoever produced more shells, more men, and more missiles would eventually prevail. Under that model, Russia wins. Russia has more of everything the model measures. The second assumption was sanctuary, the idea that Russian territory, and above all Russian strategic infrastructure deep beyond the Urals, would remain effectively untouchable, either because Ukraine lacked the range or because the West would restrain Ukraine from using the range it had. That assumption became explicit Western policy for most of 2022, 2023, and much of 2024. The third assumption was escalation dominance, the idea that the closer Ukraine came to imposing real strategic cost on Russia proper, the more likely Moscow would be to escalate horizontally, vertically, or nuclearly, and that this risk would force Kyiv, Washington, and Brussels to accept a ceiling on Ukrainian operations. Every one of those assumptions is now empirically dead, and this is where mainstream framing consistently misses the story. Consider the numbers Moscow does not want to be part of the conversation. According to Ukraine's own defense ministry and independent tracking by Georgetown's GSSR Forum, Ukraine produced roughly 2.2 million drones in 2024, at least 4 million in 2025, and is on pace for 8 million or more in 2026. 99% of them are assembled inside Ukraine. Ukrainian FPV industry alone has an assessed ceiling of up to 5 million units annually. This is not a boutique startup ecosystem. It is a wartime industrial base that, from a standing start, now outproduces the entire NATO alliance in tactical drones by an order of magnitude. Now look at the longer-range side of the ledger. Ukraine's Long Neptune cruise missile, unveiled in March 2025 and confirmed by President Zelensky as being used in combat, has a stated range of roughly 1,000 kilometers. That alone brings virtually every strategic Russian refinery west of the Urals inside the strike envelope. And then, in August 2025, Kyiv publicly revealed the FP-5 Flamingo, a domestically produced cruise missile with a 1,150-kilogram warhead and a range of 3,000 kilometers. 3,000. For context, that is farther than a Tomahawk. That places Yekaterinburg, Chelyabinsk, and much of the Russian industrial heartland under threat from a country whose president was mocked in 2022 for asking for tanks. The missile is reportedly in serial production. This is the evidence ladder that Moscow's numbers dashboard cannot answer. Russian intelligence assessments seen by Ukrainian military intelligence, reported by the Kyiv Independent and Geopolitical Monitor, place Russia's current combined cruise and ballistic missile output at roughly 2,900 units annually, with a monthly ballistic missile capacity approaching 100. Russia can now, in theory, fire 100 ballistic missiles a month at Ukraine without depleting stockpiles. That sounds catastrophic. And it would be if the model of this war were still symmetrical attrition. It is not. Because the same period in which Russian missile output climbed is the same period in which Ukrainian drones destroyed approximately 20% of Russian long-range aviation, damaged a documented 9% of Russian refining capacity, sank or damaged 14 Russian warships in the Black Sea using $50,000 class Magura naval drones per U.S. Naval Institute data, and drove roughly 70% of Russian battlefield casualties, according to Ukrainian reporting in late 2025, through drone kills rather than artillery or infantry contact. In December 2025, the Ukrainian president's office released figures showing 35,000 Russian troops hit by drones in that single month. And for the first time, drones alone accounted for the majority of Russian personnel losses. Let that sink in. Ukraine has changed not only the geography of the war, it has changed the physics of casualty generation. Russia is now taking most of its losses from unmanned systems that cost less than a used car. This is the point at which most mainstream analyses stop, catalog the tools, and treat the story as a technology profile. That framing misses what is actually happening, because the transformation is not primarily about hardware. It is about doctrine. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. Modern warfare, from the German Blitzkrieg forward, has been organized around a single doctrinal principle: mass at the decisive point. Concentrate combined arms, concentrate air power, concentrate armor, concentrate fires, and break through a specific sector before the enemy can react. Russian doctrine, inherited from Soviet operational art, is the purest surviving expression of this idea. Massed artillery, massed rocket fire, massed Shahed swarms, followed by infantry meat assaults. Between October 2025 and March 2026, Russian forces did seize roughly 1,833 square kilometers, according to the Institute for the Study of War. But they paid for that ground with an assessed 416,570 casualties across 2025 per ISW's December 31st, 2025 assessment, and CSIS now places total Russian battlefield casualties near 1.2 million since February 2022. That is 78 Russian casualties per square kilometer seized, not per district, per square kilometer. That is not a functioning doctrine. That is a doctrine surviving on demographic depth. Ukrainian doctrine, by contrast, has abandoned mass at the decisive point in favor of something older and much more dangerous when applied at scale: distributed precision, dispersed sensors, networked strike, cost imposition at every echelon. The Small Wars Journal, in its February 2026 analysis, called it the dispersion paradox. Sound Russian tactics, when observed from Ukrainian drone sensors, become death sentences. Every column concentrated for a breakthrough becomes a target list. Every fuel depot within 1,000 kilometers becomes a burning liability. Every long-range bomber on a runway becomes a $500,000 kill for a $2,000 quadcopter. The hidden variable, the one Western press releases understate, is the alliance logic that ran alongside this transformation. Ukraine's deep strike campaign became fully unshackled only after Washington, London, and Berlin quietly folded on the sanctuary doctrine that had defined the first 3 years of the war. That collapse happened in stages. It was never announced. But by the second half of 2025, Ukrainian systems were operating freely against Russian strategic depth, and Ukrainian domestically produced systems, most importantly, the Flamingo, made Western permission irrelevant. This is the part that Moscow miscalculated most catastrophically. Russia spent 3 years betting that Western political fatigue would cap Ukrainian range. Russia won that bet. And Russia still lost, because Ukraine simply built the range itself. Here's where it gets more dangerous still, because the second-order consequences of this doctrinal revolution are now beginning to spread, and they do not stop at the Ukrainian border. Every general staff in the world is reading the same reports. The Chinese military-industrial complex is dissecting spiderweb frame by frame. Iranian planners are studying the Magura sea drone campaign. North Korean observers, embedded through the Russian operational rear, are transmitting lessons back to Pyongyang. And NATO, at its own institutional pace, is beginning to admit publicly what its planners have known privately for at least 18 months. The traditional Western force structure, which is expensive, exquisite, manned, and concentrated, is now catastrophically exposed to the exact model Ukraine has industrialized. Consider the implication for a moment. A U.S. carrier strike group costs upwards of $20 billion. A Magura sea drone costs approximately $50,000. A B-52 sits on an open flight line at Barksdale or Minot the same way a Tu-95 sat exposed at Olenka. The strategic difference is not the target. The strategic difference is that Russia was the first great power to be shown the vulnerability at scale, in public, on video, on the ground it thought was untouchable. This is not a story about Ukraine winning the war outright. It is not a claim that Kyiv is on the verge of marching to Moscow. That is not the argument. The argument is narrower and much harder to dismiss. Ukraine has demonstrated empirically and repeatedly that the largest arsenal on the European continent can no longer translate its mass into decisive strategic effect against a smaller, technologically adaptive opponent operating on the new distributed model. That is a rule change. And once the rule is changed, it applies to everyone. Now consider the escalation scenarios, because this is where the next 6 to 12 months become genuinely dangerous. Scenario 1. Russia doubles down on missile mass, increasing production of Iskander, Kinzhal, Kaliber, and Shahed to try to overwhelm Ukrainian air defense and inflict decisive strategic damage on the Ukrainian energy grid and command architecture before Ukrainian deep strike capacity matures further. This is already the observable path. It has not worked in 3 years. It is unlikely to work in the 4th. Scenario 2. Russia escalates horizontally. This is the Belarus vector, and it is precisely why the pressure on Lukashenko has intensified in recent weeks. Opening a northern axis, threatening a second front, or forcing NATO to redistribute its posture toward the Suwalki Gap could, in theory, dilute Ukrainian resources. But this scenario carries an Article 5 exposure that Moscow has, to date, been unwilling to purchase. Scenario 3. Russia escalates vertically. Substrategic nuclear signaling, escalated hybrid attacks on European critical infrastructure, undersea cable sabotage, or a demonstrative use of tactical nuclear systems. The rhetorical groundwork has been laid repeatedly. The military threshold has not been crossed. It has, however, been quietly moved closer. Scenario 4, and this is the one that receives the least attention. Russia loses the deep strike war outright, not through Ukrainian conquest, but through cumulative strategic degradation. Refinery output falls below sustainable domestic and military supply. Fuel rationing widens beyond the current regional caps. Strategic aviation cannot regenerate at replacement rate. Black Sea logistics remain neutralized, and the political cost inside the Russian elite, particularly among the security services and the energy oligarchy, begins to shift from acceptable to unacceptable. That scenario does not end the war. It ends a specific Russian theory of the war. The uncomfortable reading, the one that has not yet reached Western headlines but is written plainly into the data, is that all 4 scenarios are now compatible with the same underlying fact. Russia's firepower is at an all-time high, and Russia's strategic position is worse than at any point since the spring of 2022. That is what it means to have the rules of modern warfare rewritten against you. There is one more layer, and it is the layer that matters most for what comes next. This is not a Ukrainian export. This is not a NATO doctrine. This is not a Silicon Valley product. This is a wartime national mobilization built by a country under existential threat, financed on a shoestring, distributed across thousands of small workshops, and networked through software written under active bombardment. It cannot be easily replicated by peacetime bureaucracies, but it can absolutely be studied, adapted, and applied. And every serious military in the world is now doing exactly that. The question is not whether the Ukrainian model spreads. The question is who spreads it first and against whom. Here is the sober verdict. Russia today possesses more firepower than at any point in this war. That is real. That is measurable. That is not going away in the next 12 months. Ukraine today possesses something Russia does not, and something no post-Cold War Western military has ever demonstrated at national scale. An integrated, industrialized, doctrinally coherent system for turning cheap distributed precision into strategic effect against a nuclear superpower. That is real too. That is measurable. And that is not going away either. The mainstream framing, still trapped in the vocabulary of tanks lost and villages taken, has not yet caught up to what actually happened. The war did not stall. The war changed form. And the country most exposed to that change is the country still trying to fight the old one. The next phase is already visible in outline. more flamingos rolling off Ukrainian production lines, more refineries entering the strike envelope, more Russian regions rationing fuel, more strategic aviation dispersed to bases that were supposed to be safe, more sea denial across the Black Sea, and in parallel, more Russian missile mass, more Shahed swarms, more attempts to break the Ukrainian grid, more pressure on Lukashenko, more nuclear rhetoric aimed at Western capitals. This is not a war heading toward a clean resolution. This is a war heading toward a doctrinal reckoning, and the reckoning has already begun. The clock this analyst opened with is not the clock in Kiev. It is the clock in Moscow. And the number on it is not measured in Russian shells produced or Ukrainian territory lost. It is measured in refinery weeks, in bomber airframes, in Black Sea sea lanes, in ruble reserves, in the growing gap between what Russian firepower still is on paper and what Russian firepower can still accomplish in reality. That gap is the story. That gap is why this channel will keep tracking every flamingo strike, every refinery hit, every bomber destroyed, every Lukashenko movement, every escalation signal from the Kremlin, and every quiet policy shift in Washington, London, Berlin, and Brussels that either accelerates or restrains this transformation. The rules of modern warfare have been rewritten. The consequences have barely started. Subscribe and stay with this channel because the next chapter of this war is going to be written faster than the last one. And the difference between watching it happen and understanding why it is happening will be measured in weeks, not years. This story is not over, not even close. The analysis continues in the next update.